The promise of a new life out west was a powerful thing, strong enough to make a woman like Bridget O'Malley pack her single scuffed valise, leave behind the soot-stained skies of Boston, and cross an entire continent for a man she'd never even met. For Bridget, fleeing a life of crowded tenements and lingering grief, the Montana Territory wasn't just a place on a map. It was a prayer whispered into the smoky city air. It was a bargain she'd sealed with a few drops of ink and a mountain of hope. All she had to go on was a photograph of a stern-faced rancher named Jedediah Stone and his solemn promise of a home. But when the dust of a town called Providence Gulch finally settled on her worn traveling dress, she would learn that some prayers go unanswered. She would discover that a man's heart can be a harder, more unforgiving country than any wilderness she had crossed. And she would find out that a lifetime of hope could be utterly shattered by the judgment of a single cold glance. All because of one damning feature God had given her, the fiery, untamable, and supposedly cursed color of her hair. The train groaned into Providence Gulch like a great iron beast sighing its last, weary breath. For 3 long days, Bridget O'Malley had been rocked by its rhythm, her entire world a rattling cocoon of steel and steam. Her few belongings were packed in the case at her feet, but her most precious cargo was the letter tucked safely in her bodice. The paper was soft, almost like cloth, from how many times she had read it, the ink slightly faded where her anxious fingers had traced and retraced the words. "I am a man of simple means, but honest work," Jedediah Stone had written. "My ranch is modest, but the land is good. I have a need for a wife, a partner to build a life with. Your photograph shows a woman of strength. I will meet you at the station on the 15th of June. Today was the 15th of June, 1883. Bridget pressed her face against the grimy glass of the window, her heart hammering a frantic drum against her ribs. Boston, with its endless noise and the fresh grief of her parents' passing, already felt a lifetime away. Here, the sky was an immense, aching blue, so vast it seemed to swallow the tiny cluster of raw timber buildings that made up the town. Dust, as fine as flour, coated everything in a pale, gritty film. She nervously smoothed the front of her dark green dress, a garment she had sewn herself. She'd chosen the color specifically, hoping it would temper the vibrant, coppery cascade of her hair. Her hair. It had always been a thing of comment, a subject of both admiration and scorn back in the tight-knit Irish community she'd left behind. A temper to match, some would whisper. Touched by the Fae, others would mutter darkly. But Bridget had always thought of it as the last gift from her mother, who had owned the same fiery mane. As she stepped from the train, the heat hit her like a physical blow. The air was thin and dry, smelling of dust, horses, and the distant scent of pine. The platform was a chaotic mix of men unloading freight, a few families joyfully greeting their arrivals, and the curious, lingering stares of dusty-looking townsfolk. Her eyes scanned the crowd, searching for the man from the photograph. A square-jawed man with serious eyes and a thick, dark beard. And then she saw him. Almost immediately. He stood apart from the others, taller than most, with broad shoulders that spoke of years of hard, physical labor. Jedediah Stone. He wore a simple homespun shirt and dark trousers, his face weathered by sun and wind. But the stern expression from the photograph was magnified in person, etched into deep lines around his eyes and mouth. He wasn't looking at her. He was scanning the disembarking passengers with a grim, almost angry impatience. Taking a deep breath to steady her trembling nerves, Bridget clutched her valise and started towards him. Her boots, the sturdiest things she owned, crunched on the gravelly platform. "Mr. Stone," she asked, her voice sounding smaller than she intended. He turned his head. His gaze, a startlingly pale gray, swept over her. It started at her face, her green eyes, the light dusting of freckles across her nose. And then it fell to her hair. The afternoon sun, blazing down from that endless Montana sky, struck the bun she had so meticulously pinned. It ignited the coiled strands into a brilliant, undeniable halo of copper and gold. She saw it happen, the flicker of something in his eyes. It wasn't recognition, it wasn't welcome. It was a shudder, a sudden cold hardening that seemed to travel through his entire body. His posture stiffened, his jaw tightened until a muscle bunched angrily along its line. "Jedediah Stone," she repeated, a knot of pure dread forming in her stomach. He took a half step back. It was a small movement, but it was a profound, soul-crushing gesture of rejection. He looked past her, as if searching for someone else, another woman who might be the real Bridget O'Malley from the letters. You're the woman from Boston?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble of disbelief. "I am Bridget O'Malley." She managed a small, hopeful smile, though it felt brittle and fragile on her lips. "It is a pleasure to finally meet you, Mr. Stone." He did not return the smile. He did not offer to take her bag. His gaze was now fixed on her hair, his expression a mixture of raw shock and something that looked unnervingly like pure disgust. The whispers and stares of the townsfolk on the platform seemed to intensify, their curiosity turning into a palpable, shared judgment. "The photograph," he said, his voice flat and dead. "It was in black and white. It didn't show the color." "No, sir, I suppose it wouldn't," Bridget replied, the warmth draining from her cheeks. The hope that had carried her 2,000 miles across a continent began to crumble into dust. "It is red. I can see that," he bit out. He looked around at the watching faces, and a dark flush of what looked like shame crept up his neck. He seemed not just disappointed, but deeply, personally affronted. Shamed. He took another step back, shaking his head slowly, deliberately. "No," he said, the single word a stone dropping into a deep, dark well. "This won't do. This won't do at all." Bridget's breath caught in her throat. The world seemed to stop. "Mr. Stone, I don't understand. I can't have a wife with hair like that," he said, the words spoken with a raw, guttural finality, as if he were speaking of a disease or a deformity. He wasn't just rejecting her, he was condemning her. "It's unnatural. It's a bad omen." The public nature of the dismissal was a slap in the face, sharp and stinging. Hot tears pricked at the back of Bridget's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of these people. The murmuring from the platform grew louder. A woman covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide. A man beside her snickered, a cruel, ugly sound. A bad omen. Bridget's voice was now laced with an indignation that pushed past the initial shock. "Sir, it is the color of my hair. It is how God made me." "Then God saw fit to mark you," he retorted, his voice rising, carrying across the platform for all to hear. "I lost my first wife, Martha, to the fever. She was a good, decent woman, hair as dark as a raven's wing. I will not bring a curse into my home. I won't have the whole county whispering." He turned his back on her then. A complete and total dismissal. He took 2 steps towards the general store, then he paused. He looked over his shoulder, not at her face, but at her valise on the ground. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a few coins, and tossed them onto the dusty platform. They landed with a series of soft, insulting thuds near her feet. "For your trouble," Jedediah Stone grunted, his face a mask of cold stone. "Find a room for the night. The morning stagecoach heads east. Be on it." And with that, he strode away, disappearing into the crowd without a second glance. Bridget O'Malley stood alone on the platform. The train that had carried her dreams west let out a long, mournful whistle as it began to pull away, leaving her stranded in a cloud of steam and dust. The coins lay glinting in the harsh sunlight, a pittance offered for a shattered future. The weight of 1,000 hostile stares pressed down on her, and for the first time in her life, the vibrant, fiery hair she had inherited from her mother felt not like a gift, but a brand that had just cost her everything. The steam cleared. The train was gone. The world rushed in on Bridget with a terrifying silence, broken only by the snickers and hushed, venomous whispers of the townsfolk. Red as sin. Jed Stone's got more sense than that. Look at her, bold as brass. Each word was a tiny, sharp stone hurled directly at her heart. Humiliation burned hotter than the Montana sun. Her first instinct was to flee, to run and hide until the eastbound stagecoach could carry her away from this cruel, barren place. But where would she go? Back to the suffocating poverty of Boston. She had sold nearly everything she owned for the train ticket. The coins Jedediah Stone had thrown at her feet wouldn't even cover a week's board. But then a different feeling began to smolder beneath the shame. Anger. A hard, defiant anger that had been forged in the crucible of a difficult life. She would not be broken on a dusty train platform by a superstitious, grief-stricken fool. With a straight spine and a defiant lift of her chin, she ignored the glinting coins. Leaving them there was a small act of defiance, but it was hers. She bent, picked up her valise, and marched directly off the platform, her gaze fixed forward, refusing to meet the eyes of the gossips. She needed a place to stay. The town consisted of one main street, a dusty thoroughfare lined with false-fronted buildings. There was a general store, a blacksmith, a land office, and 2 saloons. Tucked between the larger of the 2 saloons and the undertaker's parlor was a faded sign that read, Higgins Boarding House. Rooms and meals, no riffraff. Bridget pushed open the door. The air inside was cooler and smelled of stale beer, sawdust, and frying bacon. The ground floor was a saloon, quiet in the afternoon, save for a few grizzled prospectors nursing drinks at a corner table. A formidable woman with iron-gray hair, pulled into a severe bun, was wiping down the long, polished bar. Her face was a road map of hard-lived years, but her eyes were sharp and intelligent. "Looking for something?" the woman asked, her voice raspy. "I'd like to inquire about a room," Bridget said, keeping her voice as steady as she could. The woman's eyes flicked up, taking in Bridget's entire appearance, lingering for just a moment on her hair. A flicker of something, not judgment, but a weary recognition, crossed her face. "Just got into town on the afternoon train, did you?" "Yes." "You the one Jed Stone was waiting for?" The question was blunt, direct. News traveled faster than a telegraph in Providence Gulch. Bridget felt her cheeks flush, but she met the woman's gaze head-on. "I was." The woman let out a short, humorless laugh. "That man's grief has curdled his brain. Thinks his first wife, Martha, was some kind of saint walking on earth. She was a sour, complaining woman who wouldn't have lasted another winter here anyway. He's just looking for a ghost to marry." She leaned her elbows on the bar. "Name's Beatrice Higgins. B. I own this place, and I saw what he did, throwing coin at you like you were, well, it wasn't right." A tiny sliver of relief pierced Bridget's despair. "I need a room, just until I can figure out what to do." B eyed her. "You got money?" "I have some. Not much. Jed's charity is still lying in the dust out there." "It is," Bridget said firmly. A ghost of a smile touched B's lips. "Good for you. All right, a room upstairs is 2 bits a night. Meals are extra. You can work it off if you need to. I can always use help cleaning this pigsty and serving the miners their grub. It's hard work, and the men can be forward. I'm not afraid of hard work, Mrs. Higgins, Bridget said, a wave of gratitude washing over her. It's B, the woman corrected her, and we'll see about that. The room B gave her was small and sparse, containing only a narrow cot, a wash basin, and a single window that looked out onto the bleak alley between the saloon and the undertaker's. But it was a sanctuary. Bridget closed the door, leaned her back against it, and finally allowed the tears to fall. They were hot, angry tears for the wasted journey, the public humiliation, and the sudden terrifying uncertainty of her future. But what she didn't know was that her troubles in Providence Gulch had only just begun. The whispers on the platform were just the opening notes of a symphony of hate that was about to consume the entire town. The next few days were a brutal lesson in isolation. When Bridget walked down the street to the general store, conversations would cease mid-sentence. Women would physically pull their children closer, their faces tight with suspicion and pious judgment. Men would stare, some with open, gawking curiosity, others with a leering glint in their eyes that made her skin crawl with revulsion. The architect of this town-wide ostracism was clear. On Sunday, Reverend Theron Pike, a gaunt man with eyes that burned with a righteous, almost manic fire, delivered a sermon that echoed through the thin walls of the small church. While he didn't use her name, his thunderous words about vanity and temptation arriving in new and colorful forms left no doubt as to his target. Jedediah Stone sat in the front pew, his face grim and unmoving, absorbing the preacher's words like a thirsty man drinking validation. Bridget found her only solace in work. She scrubbed floors until her knuckles were raw. She washed mountains of greasy plates until her hands were chapped and sore. She learned to carry heavy trays of food and beer through the boisterous, often rowdy evening crowd at the saloon. B was a fair, if demanding, taskmaster. She said little, but Bridget would sometimes catch the older woman, watching her with a look of grudging respect. It was during her second week in Providence Gulch that she first saw him. She was out back, shaking a dusty rug, when a small group of Lakota rode to the edge of town to trade. They were a common, if often tense, sight. They traded furs and intricate beadwork for flour, sugar, and metal goods. While the other townsfolk kept a weary, suspicious distance, Bridget found herself watching them, intrigued. One man sat straighter on his horse than the others. He was younger than the elders he rode with, but he carried an air of quiet, unshakable authority. His face was striking, with high cheekbones and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to miss nothing. His long black hair was bound in 2 braids, and a single eagle feather was tied at the back. Unlike the others, who focused on their trading at the general store, his gaze swept over the entire town, observant and assessing. Then, his eyes met hers. It was only for a moment. Bridget, now accustomed to being stared at, expected the same gawking curiosity or outright suspicion she received from the settlers. Instead, his expression was one of calm, profound neutrality. His gaze dropped for a fraction of a second to her hair, which she had tied back in a simple braid, but there was no judgment in it. Only a quiet, unreadable appraisal. Then he turned his attention back to his companions. The moment was fleeting, but it stuck with Bridget. In a town where every eye condemned her, that one brief, neutral glance felt like a breath of fresh air. It was the first time since her arrival that someone had looked at her and not immediately seen a curse, a temptation, or a freak. They had just seen a woman, standing in the sun, shaking a rug. In the crushing loneliness of Providence Gulch, that was enough to plant a tiny, resilient seed of hope in her heart. She didn't know his name, but she remembered his eyes. They were as dark and deep as the Montana night sky, and she had a feeling she would see them again. July bled into August, and a suffocating blanket of heat and dust settled over Providence Gulch. The creek that ran south of town shrank to a muddy, sluggish trickle. The pastures on Jedediah Stone's ranch, visible from the low hills behind the boarding house, turned a sickly, dying shade of brown. The sun beat down relentlessly, day after day, baking the very earth into a cracked, barren wasteland. A drought had taken hold of the land, and with the drought came fear. And in a town like Providence Gulch, fear always needed a target. The whispers that had followed Bridget down the street grew louder, more venomous. They started in the sewing circles and over the fences of the town's more pious women, but they found their amplification in the pulpit of Reverend Pike. "The Lord sends us trials to test our faith," he thundered from his pulpit, his bony finger jabbing at the hot, stagnant air. "But he also sends us signs of his displeasure. When wickedness is allowed to walk openly in our midst, when vanity and strange ways are left unchecked, the very heavens can close up, the rains will cease, and the land will perish." No one had to ask what wickedness or what vanity he was referring to. Every eye in that church would subtly shift towards the back pew where B. Higgins sat, or out the windows towards the saloon where the red-haired woman worked. Bridget had stopped attending services after the first week, unable to bear the crushing weight of the collective condemnation. Jedediah Stone became a ghost, haunting the edges of Bridget's new life. She would see him at the general store, his face growing more gaunt and worried as the drought wore on. He bought expensive feed for his dwindling cattle, his movements stiff with a gnawing anxiety. He never looked at her, never acknowledged her presence, but she could feel his eyes on her back. She could feel his presence like a pressure change in the air. He was suffering, his ranch dying before his eyes, and the town's whispers provided him with a simple, terrible answer as to why. He had seen the omen, and in his folly, he had let it stay. His foreman, a pragmatic and decent man named Silas Cobb, tried to be a voice of reason. "Jed, this is just a dry spell. We had one back in '78, worse than this," Silas told him one afternoon, as they surveyed a field of withered, dead corn. "It's got nothing to do with that girl in town." "You didn't see it, Silas," Jedediah muttered, kicking at a cloud of dust. "The sun hitting her hair, like she was on fire. It ain't natural. Pike says the devil can take pleasing forms." "Pike's a fool who thinks a thunderstorm is God's personal wrath for Mrs. Henderson's loud singing," Silas retorted. "The girl's just a girl, alone and trying to get by. What you did at that station, Jed, it was a cruel thing." Jedediah's face darkened. "I did what I had to do to protect my home, my memories of Martha." But the memory of Martha was becoming a prison. He saw her everywhere, in the empty chair at his kitchen table, in the scent of dried lavender she used to keep in her drawers. In his mind, he had built her up into a paragon of virtue, a perfect woman of quiet piety and dark-haired beauty. The vibrant, living reality of Bridget O'Malley had been a shocking affront to that carefully constructed shrine of grief. Rejecting her had felt like a defense of his lost wife. But now, with his land withering away, it felt like he had only invited a different, more terrible kind of curse. Bridget, meanwhile, fought her own battles. Work was her only armor. She rose before dawn to help Bee bake bread and stayed up late scrubbing the saloon floor after the last drunk had been poured into the street. She saved every single penny. Her goal now wasn't a husband's home, but the price of a stagecoach ticket to somewhere, anywhere, else. Yet survival was more than just money. It was the daily struggle against a soul-crushing loneliness. Bee was not unkind, but she was not a friend. Her manner was perpetually brisk and businesslike. The only moments of respite came on the rare occasions when the Lakota came to trade. She saw the man with the eagle feather several more times. He learned her routine. He would see her in the alley beating rugs or peeling potatoes on a stool by the back door. He never approached, never spoke, but he would sometimes offer a slow, deliberate nod of his head. It was a simple acknowledgement of her existence, a gesture that cost him nothing but was worth the world to Bridget. One sweltering afternoon, as she was drawing water from the well behind the saloon, one of his companions, an older woman with a face like a beautiful, wrinkled apple, approached her. She pointed a finger at Bridget's red braid, then smiled a wide, nearly toothless grin. She said something in her own language, the words soft and flowing. The man with the feather stepped forward. "She says you have the color of the sunset on the prairie," he said. His voice was deep and calm, with a cadence that was completely different from the harsh, clipped tones of the settlers. It was the first time he had ever spoken to her. Bridget was so startled she nearly dropped the bucket. "Oh," she managed. "Thank you. Please, please thank her for me." He translated, and the old woman patted Bridget's arm before moving on. He remained for a moment, his dark eyes watching her face. "They call you the woman who angered the sky," he said. Bridget's heart sank. "So you've heard the town's gossip." "It is hard not to hear a shout," he replied simply. "They say you have stopped the rain." "And do you believe that?" she asked, a challenge in her voice. He looked up at the vast, cloudless sky, then back at her. "The sky has its own spirit. It does not listen to the fears of small men. It is dry because it is dry. It will rain when it is time to rain." He gave her that same quiet, respectful nod. "My name is Matau." "Bridget," she replied, finally finding her voice. "Bridget," he repeated. The name sounded different, softer in his mouth. He then turned and followed his people, leaving Bridget by the well with a racing heart. Matau. He had a name, and in his simple, profound words, he had offered her more kindness and common sense than the entire population of Providence Gulch combined. He didn't see a curse. He saw the sunset. But as the days remained relentlessly, punishingly dry, Bridget knew that the rest of the town only saw the shadow of the witch they were so desperate to find. And she was standing right in the middle of it. The town was a tinderbox of fear and suspicion. And on a moonless night in late August, the spark was finally struck. It wasn't a curse. It wasn't an act of God. It was a simple, worldly accident. A lantern, kicked over by a spooked horse in the livery stable, sent a river of burning oil flowing into a pile of dry hay. Bridget was woken by the frantic, panicked clang of the church bell, a sound reserved only for the gravest of emergencies. She threw a shawl over her nightgown and rushed to her window. The alley was bathed in a terrifying, flickering orange light. The sky, which for weeks had been a uniform, starless black, now glowed with a malevolent, pulsing heart. Shouts erupted from the street. "Fire! The livery's on fire!" She joined the stream of people pouring out of the saloon and boarding house. The heat was immense, even from 100 yards away. Flames leaped from the livery's roof, devouring the dry timber with a hungry, terrifying roar. The whole town had gathered, a chaotic assembly of panicked faces illuminated by the inferno. Men formed a bucket brigade from the town's main well, a desperate and futile effort against the raging blaze. The water seemed to evaporate into steam before it even hit the flames. Bridget stood near the back, horrified, watching the stable, the lifeblood of the town's transport and trade, being consumed by the fire. In the heart of the chaos, she saw Jedediah Stone, his face streaked with soot, working with the other men, his movements frantic and desperate. For a moment she felt a pang of sympathy for him, for all of them. This was their home, their livelihood, turning to ash before their very eyes. The fire burned itself out by dawn, leaving behind a smoldering, blackened skeleton of a building. The acrid smell of wet ash and smoke hung heavy in the air. The townsfolk stood in stunned, exhausted silence, surveying the utter devastation. The livery was a total loss, along with half a dozen horses that hadn't been rescued in time. As the sun rose, casting a sickly yellow light through the haze, Reverend Pike stepped onto the porch of the general store. His face was grim, his eyes burning with a terrible, unshakable certainty. "My friends, my flock!" His voice rang out, cutting through the weary silence. "We have been tested by drought, and now we are tested by fire. Do you not see the pattern? Do you not see the hand of Providence at work? This is a cleansing. This is a warning." A low murmur went through the crowd. They were exhausted, scared, and desperate for someone to blame. "We have tolerated a blight in our midst." Pike's voice rose to a fever pitch. He raised a trembling arm and pointed. Not at the fire, but directly into the crowd, directly at Bridget. "She came and the rain stopped," he shrieked, his voice cracking with fury. "She stayed, and now the fires have come, the fires of hell, brought to our very doorstep by a woman with the devil's own flame in her hair." The accusation hung in the smoky air, sharp and deadly as a shard of glass. Every head turned, 100 pairs of eyes fixed on Bridget. The neighborly concern from moments before curdled into suspicion, then into outright, ugly hostility. "I saw her," a woman near the front shouted. "I saw her near the livery yesterday evening, just walking by." "She's a witch," another man yelled, emboldened by the preacher. "My milk cow went dry last week." The mob mentality, a terrifying and mindless beast, took hold. The crowd surged, their fear and anger coalescing around a single, convenient target. They began to close in on her. Bridget stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked around for a friendly face, but saw only twisted masks of rage. She saw B. Higgins, her arms crossed, her expression grim and powerless against the tide. She saw Silas Cobb trying to push through the crowd to get to her, but he was too far away. And then she saw Jedediah Stone. He stood 20 feet away, his face a canvas of conflicting emotions. He looked at her, then at his ruined town, then at the preacher whipping the crowd into a frenzy. This was his chance to stop it, to speak the truth, that this was a tragedy, not a hex, that she was just a woman, not a demon. Their eyes met across the sea of angry faces. Bridget's gaze was a silent, desperate plea. "Say something. You brought me here. Don't let them do this." But Jedediah Stone remained silent. He watched as the preacher's words fanned the flames of their hatred. He saw the raw, primal fear in his neighbor's eyes, and felt it echo his own superstitious dread. To defend her would be to align himself with the curse he believed she carried. To defend her would be to betray the memory of his sainted Martha. He dropped his gaze, turning his face away in a moment of devastating, damnable cowardice. His silence was her conviction. "Get her!" someone screamed. The crowd surged forward, hands clawed at her, grabbing her arms, her shawl. Rough fingers tangled in her hair, pulling her head back with a vicious jerk. She cried out, a sound of pure terror and betrayal. They were dragging her, pulling her through the dust towards the town well, their faces contorted with a righteous, holy fury. "Throw the witch in the well! See if she floats!" Bridget struggled, but she was no match for their collective strength. The world became a dizzying, terrifying blur of angry faces, smoke, and the hate-filled shouts of the people of Providence Gulch. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone, condemned by superstition and abandoned by the one man who could have saved her. Just as the mob reached the town well, dragging a terrified and struggling Bridget with them, a new sound cut through the clamor. It wasn't a shout or a gunshot. It was the steady, rhythmic beat of horse hooves. 4 riders appeared at the end of the main street, materializing from the smoky dawn like apparitions. They were Lakota. At their head, sitting tall and still on a powerful buckskin horse, was Matau. He and his companions had clearly been on their way to town to trade when they came upon the scene of chaos. They stopped. Their sudden, silent presence immediately sucked the energy out of the crowd. The settlers, caught in their fever pitch of accusation, faltered. Generations of ingrained fear and mistrust of the Lakota were a powerful deterrent. The mob loosened its grip on Bridget, their attention shifting to the new, potential threat. Matau's face was unreadable, but his dark eyes missed nothing. He saw the smoldering ruins of the livery. He saw Reverend Pike, still puffed up with righteous fury. He saw Jedediah Stone standing apart, his face a pale mask of conflict. And he saw Bridget, her dress torn, her hair pulled from its braid, her eyes wide with terror. He dismounted in one fluid, graceful motion. He did not draw a weapon. His authority came not from the threat of violence, but from an absolute and unnerving calm. He walked slowly, deliberately, towards the center of the crowd, his moccasins making no sound in the dust. The townsfolk parted before him as if by magic. "You make a great noise this morning," Matau said, his voice quiet, yet carrying in the sudden, tense silence. He addressed the crowd, but his eyes were on Reverend Pike. "This is town business," the preacher snapped, regaining some of his composure. "It does not concern you. We are dealing with a witch who brought this destruction upon us." Matau's gaze shifted to the burned-out livery. He walked towards it, a path clearing for him as he went. He knelt, picking up a twisted piece of the shattered lantern, its metal still warm. He sniffed it, then looked at the pattern of the charring on the remaining floorboards. He pointed with his chin towards the back of the ruins. "The fire started there," he said, his voice a simple statement of fact. "Where the hay was stored. The wind blew west last night. It pushed the fire towards the front. If a person had set it, they would have started it by the door to the west to make their escape." He stood and walked back to the center, holding up the piece of the lantern for all to see. "This is the only magic I see here," he declared. "A careless man's magic, the kind that spills fire where it shouldn't be." His logic was simple, direct, and utterly irrefutable. It cut through the superstitious hysteria like a sharp knife. A murmur of doubt rippled through the crowd. They had been so certain, so swept up in the preacher's rhetoric, but the physical evidence presented by this stoic outsider was undeniable. That proves nothing," Pike sputtered, his authority crumbling before his eyes. "She used her dark arts to—" Matau turned his full attention to the preacher. His eyes, normally so calm, held a dangerous glint of steel. "Your God is a fearful one, Black Robe. He's afraid of the sun and the wind and the color of a woman's hair." He then turned and walked directly to Bridget. The men holding her let go, stepping back as if he carried an electric charge. He stood before her, his presence a shield against the rest of the town. He gently reached out, not to touch her, but to gesture towards her disheveled, fiery hair, which caught the first direct rays of the morning sun. The crowd fell completely silent. They watched as this Lakota warrior, a man they considered a savage, looked with reverence at the very thing they had condemned. "Your people are fools," Matau said, his voice low and meant only for her, yet it carried to those closest. "They live in the dark and are afraid of the light." He looked from her hair to her eyes. "In my language we have a word, Wijanjan. It means the light of the sun, the dazzling brightness that makes you strong. When a woman is brave, when her spirit is fierce and cannot be broken, we say her spirit burns with Wijanjan." He looked back at her hair, a cascade of copper and gold in the morning light, a stark and beautiful contrast to the gray ash and black soot surrounding them. They say you burn with the devil's fire, he said, his voice resonating with a profound, unshakable truth. They are wrong. You burn with the light of the sun. It was not a compliment. It was a declaration, a naming of her spirit. In that single powerful moment, Bridget felt the brand of her shame fall away, replaced by a surge of strength she didn't know she possessed. Someone finally saw her. Not an omen, not a witch, not a rejected bride, but a force of nature, as powerful and undeniable as the sun in the sky. He offered her his hand. You are not safe here. Without a second's hesitation, Bridget placed her hand in his. His grip was firm and steady. He turned, leading her through the stunned and silent crowd. They parted for them as if they were the Red Sea. No one dared to stop them. Reverend Pike's mouth hung open, his sermon of hate rendered impotent. Jedediah Stone watched her go. He watched the woman he had rejected, the woman he had abandoned to a mob, be led to safety by a man who saw in her the very opposite of what he had feared. He saw the strength in her walk, the proud lift of her head, and for the first time, a sliver of doubt, sharp and painful, pierced his armor of grief and superstition. He had not cast out a curse, he had cast out the sun. And the weight of his mistake, his monumental, cowardly mistake, began to settle upon him, as heavy and as cold as a tombstone. Matau did not take Bridget far. He led her to the small, temporary camp his people had set up in the cottonwood grove by the nearly dry creek bed, a place they always used when they came to trade. It was a world away from the suffocating judgment of Providence Gulch. Here, there was a quiet dignity, the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat, the soft, flowing cadence of the Lakota language. The older woman who had admired Bridget's hair, whose name she learned was Tassina, gave her a bowl of savory stew and a warm buffalo robe to ward off the morning chill. No one asked questions. No one stared with malice. They simply made a space for her, a silent offering of sanctuary. Bridget sat by their fire, her hands wrapped around the warm bowl, and watched as Matau spoke with the other men. His words were calm, but his gestures were firm. They were packing their belongings. It was no longer safe to trade here. The trust had been broken. She stayed with them through the day. The weight of the morning's terror slowly receded, replaced by a profound sense of peace she hadn't felt since before she left Boston. She was an outsider here too, of course, but it was a simple, factual otherness, not the hateful, malicious exclusion she'd faced in town. These people judged her by her actions, or lack thereof, not by the color of her hair. As evening approached, Matau came to sit by her side. "We leave at sunrise," he said, his eyes on the fire. "We will take you north to the next settlement. It is a bigger town, near the fort. You will be safer there." "Thank you," Bridget said, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved my life." "A person's life should not need saving from such foolishness," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "The man, Stone, he is the one who sent for you?" Bridget nodded, the name leaving a bitter taste in her mouth. "He is a man who lives in a prison made of his own memories," Matau said with startling insight. "He looks at you and does not see a woman. He sees a threat to his ghosts. A man who worships the dead cannot live among the living." His words perfectly encapsulated the tragedy of Jedediah Stone. Bridget felt a flicker of something that was almost pity, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of his face turned away from her as the mob closed in. Back in Providence Gulch, Jedediah was living in his own private hell. The town was buzzing with the morning's events. The story of the Lakota's intervention and Matau's powerful, logical rebuke of the preacher had spread like wildfire. Some, like the Reverend, saw it as further proof of her evil influence, that she had consorted with savages. But for many, Matau's simple logic about the lantern had planted a seed of doubt. The mob's fever had broken, leaving behind a bitter residue of shame. That afternoon, Silas Cobb found Jedediah in his barn, staring blankly at an empty stall. "You should have said something, Jed," Silas said, his voice devoid of its usual friendliness. "You stood there and let them nearly kill her." "It wasn't my place," Jedediah mumbled, not meeting his foreman's eyes. "Not your place," Silas exploded. "You brought her 2,000 miles to this godforsaken dust bowl. You made her your business the moment you sent that letter, and then you turned your back on her. Jed, I never took you for a coward." The word struck Jedediah like a physical blow. "You don't understand." "Oh, I understand just fine," Silas pressed on, his pent-up anger finally boiling over. "You've been hiding behind Martha's memory for 2 years. You talk about her like she was an angel, but I remember her, Jed. I remember a woman who complained about the heat, the cold, the dust, and the work. A woman who looked down on anyone who wasn't from her fancy town back east. She wouldn't have made it here. Bridget O'Malley. She had the grit for this country. You saw it in her eyes the day she arrived. And you were scared of it. Scared that a living, breathing woman might be stronger than your precious ghost." Every word was a nail hammered into the coffin of Jedediah's self-deception. He had built a myth around Martha, and Silas had just torn it down with the plain, unvarnished truth. The realization was crushing. His rejection of Bridget hadn't been about honoring his first wife. It had been about his own fear. He spent the night in a torment of regret. The image of Bridget's face, pleading with him for help, was burned into his mind. He had failed a fundamental test of character. He was, as Silas had said, a coward. The next morning, he woke with a grim resolve. He had to find her. He had to apologize, to make it right somehow. He rode into town, his heart heavy with dread, only to be told by a grim-faced B. Higgins that the Lakota and Bridget were long gone. "You had your chance to play the man, Stone," B. said, her eyes like chips of ice. "You let that chance ride out of town at dawn." As Jedediah stood on the street, defeated, a strange thing happened. The wind shifted. The air grew thick and heavy, smelling of rain. A dark line of clouds, the first in nearly 2 months, appeared on the western horizon. By midday, the heavens opened. A slow, steady drizzle turned into a downpour. The thirsty earth drank greedily. The sound of rain on the dusty street was a miracle. People came out of their homes and shops, turning their faces to the sky, laughing with relief. The drought had broken. But for Jedediah Stone, the rain was not a blessing. It was a judgment. It had come only after she was gone. The irony was so bitter, so absolute, it felt like a cosmic joke at his expense. He stood in the middle of the street, not bothering to seek shelter, letting the cold rain soak him to the bone. He had blamed her for the drought, and now the sky itself was proving him a fool. The rain washed the dust from the town, but Jedediah knew that no amount of water could ever wash the stain of his actions from his soul. 2 years passed. The good rains that began the day Bridget left had returned Providence Gulch to a state of modest prosperity. Jedediah Stone's ranch survived and even thrived, but the man himself was a changed man. The hardness in his face had been replaced by a deep and abiding sorrow. The fire in Reverend Pike's sermons had dimmed, his credibility shattered by the breaking of the drought and the lingering shame of the day of the fire. The town had moved on, as towns do, but the story of the rejected bride and the Lakota who called her the sun had become a part of its folklore, a cautionary tale about fear and foolishness. Jedediah had tried to find her. 6 months after she left, consumed by a desperate need for absolution, he rode north to Fort Benton, the next major settlement. He asked everywhere, describing a young woman with fiery hair. He found traces of her. She had arrived with the Lakota, they said. She'd found work as a seamstress for the wife of an officer at the fort. She was quiet, hard-working, and respected. He finally found the officer's home and knocked on the door, his heart in his throat. A stern-looking woman answered. "I'm looking for Bridget O'Malley," he said, his voice hoarse. "She's not here," the woman replied coolly. "She left months ago, saved her money and bought a small plot of land downriver. A little homestead. She's making a go of it on her own." The woman looked him up and down, her eyes sharp. "You're the one from Providence Gulch, aren't you? The rancher?" Jedediah could only nod, shamefaced. "She's better off," the woman said, and closed the door in his face. He understood. An apology wouldn't fix what he had broken. It was for his benefit, not hers. She didn't need his forgiveness. She had forged her own. He rode back to Providence Gulch and accepted his solitary life, forever haunted by the ghost of a woman who was very much alive. Bridget's homestead was a small two-room cabin nestled in a grove of aspen near the river. The land wasn't prime, but it was hers. She had a thriving garden, a flock of chickens, and a goat. She earned money by sewing and mending for the people in Fort Benton, her skill with the needle becoming well known. It was a hard life, a lonely life, but it was a life she had built with her own two hands. Her independence was a fortress. She still saw Matau. He and his people would pass through the area on their seasonal journeys. He would always stop, sometimes bringing a gift of fresh meat or furs, and she would give him bread or fresh eggs in return. They would sit outside her cabin and talk for hours. He told her of his people's ways, of the spirits of the land and the sky. She told him of Boston, of the sea, of a life he could barely imagine. Their connection was not the whirlwind romance of stories. It was something quieter, deeper. It was built on a foundation of mutual respect. He was the man who had seen her strength when she was at her weakest. She was the woman who looked at him not as a savage, but as a wise and honorable man. One autumn afternoon, he arrived as the aspen leaves were turning a brilliant gold. They sat on her porch, watching the river flow by. "You have made a good home here," Matau said, his gaze taking in the neat cabin and the well-tended garden. "Your spirit is strong in this place." "I learned I had to be," Bridget replied. "There was no one else to be strong for me." "You do not need a man like Jedediah Stone," he said. "You do not need to be a part of a town like that." "No," she said softly. "I don't." He reached into a leather pouch at his side and pulled out a small, intricately beaded necklace. In the center was a single polished stone the color of a sunset. He held it out to her. "This is for you," he said. "The stone is from a place sacred to my people, a place where the morning sun touches the earth first." Bridget took it, her fingers brushing his. The stone was warm. She looked at him, at his kind, steady eyes, and saw not a rescuer, but a partner, an equal. The world saw them as two different people from two different worlds, impossibly far apart. But here, on this small patch of land she called home, they were simply two souls who understood the nature of resilience. She didn't know what the future held. Perhaps he would continue to be a cherished friend who passed through with the seasons. Perhaps, in time, it would become something more. But as she fastened the necklace around her neck, she knew one thing for certain. Her new life had not been granted by a husband or a town's acceptance. She had forged it herself, out of the ashes of a cruel rejection. She had been sent west to find a home with a man named Stone, but she had found her own providence in the earth, in her work, and in the eyes of a Lakota man who knew that she didn't carry a curse, but burned with a light that was brighter than the sun. Bridget O'Malley's journey across the vast, unforgiving American West was meant to end at the altar of a church, with her life defined by the man who had summoned her. Instead, she was cast out, condemned for the very fire that defined her. But her story didn't end in that dusty street. It began there. It's a powerful reminder that our true worth is never determined by the prejudices of others. It is forged in the fires of our greatest trials. Her tale shows us that true sight doesn't come from the eyes, but from the spirit, the ability to see a sunset where others see only a flame, to see strength where others see a curse. She found that the brightest light isn't one you find in another person, but the one you nurture within yourself until it cannot be extinguished. If this story of courage and defiance in the face of bitter prejudice resonated with you, please take a moment to hit the like button. Share it with someone who might need a reminder of their own inner strength, and be sure to subscribe for more true-to-life tales from the untamed heart of the Wild West. Thanks for watching.